Good afternoon to our viewers in Germany and good morning to our viewers in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'd like to welcome you to today's conversation. As many of our regular viewers know, this time slot is when we usually have our Kaffeepause, and when we check in with a Berlin-based journalist to catch up on current events and measure the pulse of what's going on in Berlin. But as many of our viewers know, today is actually a holiday in Germany, and we're not in New York, but in Washington, D.C., gearing up for our German-American conference together with Atlantikbrücke. And so I thought this might be a good opportunity to hone in on one topic with a journalist from the Washington Post. And I am delighted to welcome Catherine Belton. She reports on Russia for the Washington Post, and she's the author of a tremendous book on Russia called Putin's People. Catherine is also part of a team of reporters who recently published a piece about a Russian attempt to unite the two far ends of Germany's political spectrum in a so-called peace movement. According to sensitive Russian documents obtained by European intelligence services and reviewed by the Post, the Kremlin is working to build an anti-war coalition in Germany by uniting the far-left Die Linke party and the far-right Alternative for Germany, or AfD. So with that, Catherine, first off, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about these documents. What kind of documents did you and your colleagues have a chance to review?
Thanks so much for having me join you today. It's really great to discuss this with you. It was tremendously interesting to report this story, and I think also very important for the future of the war, because clearly from the documents that we were able to review that were shared with us, it was very clear that the Kremlin sees Germany as the key focal point for their efforts to undermine Western support for Ukraine in this war. And it's kind of, as we wrote, it's sort of a second hidden front in the war. Of course, everyone is following the movements on the battlefield very closely, and this is very important. But of great importance for the Russians too are their efforts to try and undermine and manipulate opinion in the West, so that politicians in the West start to back off from providing military and financial support for Ukraine. And it was very clear from the documents that they have honed in on Germany as the most important country, the most important one economically and in terms of military support, as the one that they really wanted to focus on, and as potentially a weak link, because as you all know, there have been very traditionally strong ties between Russia and Germany. There is a tradition going back to the 80s or maybe even the 70s of peace movements that Soviets had long infiltrated and tried to use to undermine the West way back in Soviet times during the Cold War. And it's essentially, the documents really showed how those traditions were being revived.
So I definitely want to come back to some of the parallels between initiatives during the Cold War and what we're seeing right now. From some of our Kaffeepause discussions over the last 6 months or so, it's been interesting to follow some of the Monday demonstrations beginning in places like Leipzig, where we've seen representatives from the far left and from the far right coming together, protesting against the war, against the delivery of heavy military equipment to Ukraine for it to defend itself, and really sort of a discussion about a peace movement, so to say, in Germany. And it has been surprising because there is not a lot of alignment in viewpoints between the two sort of outer fringes of Germany's political spectrum. And yet beneath the surface, it has seemed as if there's some alignment on this issue. Can you talk a little bit more about that connection and what has sort of drawn these two very different political factions together?
Yes, I mean, it seems like, the Kremlin does have long-standing ties with members of Die Linke and members of AfD. That's for sure. But then the members of Die Linke, most notably Sarah Wagenknecht, who's kind of a renegade member who is leading the peace, so-called peace movement for Die Linke. And the AfD, they would, of course, say that this is not dictated by the Kremlin in any way, but this is kind of part of their natural instincts, that the AfD in particular, it's anti-liberal establishment, it's anti-globalist, it's anti-US hegemony, as the far left is too. And so they share this kind of common platform, which of course the Kremlin can seek to leverage. And this also, as you know, has grassroots support in Germany as well, a kind of an anti-establishment trend. And we first saw this, of course, before the winter protests. We saw it in during the pandemic, when really we saw for the very first time this mingling of the far left, the far right, and the anti-vaxxers in protests against restrictions for the pandemic. And the AfD members that I spoke to were very proud of this alliance, about how it had occurred naturally during the pandemic. And they would sort of boast about how the far left, who thought we were all neo-Nazis, they joined the protests against us, saw that we were normal people. And then, of course, when they returned home, one of them said to sew their knitted socks. They were shocked to see on television that they were being branded as neo-Nazis by the mainstream TV just because they were rubbing shoulders with us. And now they see our true face, and we're not as bad as the bogeymen were painted to be. So they were very interested, some of them, in trying to cultivate this alliance. But I also realized I didn't quite properly answer your initial question about the documents themselves. So the documents themselves were, as you mentioned, they were obtained by a European intelligence service, a very credible source. And we went through these documents, and basically they describe how the Kremlin, or the first deputy Kremlin chief of staff, Sergei Kirienko, in July last year, very shortly after Putin gave quite a speech to Russian lawmakers, basically saying this is the end of the US hegemony over the world. This is the end of US post-Cold War hegemony. And he was saying that even in satellite states, they realize that they are as vassals to the US, and the way the US is leading them is not in their national interests. So more or less a week after Putin gives this speech, the first Kremlin Deputy Chief of Staff, Sergei Kirienko, the documents show or indicate that he called a group of political strategists into the Kremlin and essentially told them to exploit this kind of divide between what's perceived, particularly by politicians in AfD, as kind of between the national interests of Germany and sort of following the Atlanticist-led world order. And so the documents show essentially how political strategists were trying to implement the Kremlin orders. They were told to focus on Germany as the main country to sap Western support for Ukraine. They were told to work on plans to discredit NATO, the US and EU, all these international institutions within Germany. They began compiling schedules for the protests that were to be held beginning from late August. They were drawing up slogans for some of them. It's not clear whether they were organizing some of them or initiating some of them, but one of the security officials we spoke to said, yes, they probably had a hand in initiating some of them. And some of the schedules that we saw included protests led by the Reichsbürger movement. We also saw how they were basically working with troll farms who were putting together slogans for social media, setting up YouTube channels for understanding the Russians, and really just trying to kind of build up sort of pro-Russian support within the German population. And then by very early September, these political strategists were also told by Kremlin officials that they should essentially do a reset for AfD, and that this is when they called for an alliance between AfD and Die Linke, but Die Linke led the element led by Sarah Wagenknecht and her husband Oskar Lafontaine, who is not exactly Die Linke, but very much aligned with Sarah Wagenknecht. And they began to draw up a manifesto for a new party of German unity, which would bring together Wagenknecht and AfD. And, the AfD members, of course, say this is all very well on paper, but, we might share a common agenda in trying to counter US support for Ukraine, but we still have diametrically opposed views on the economy, so we're not sure if it can ever officially happen. But despite that, as you all know, Sarah Wagenknecht is now considering leaving Die Linke, setting up her own party, which is very much likely to draw substantial support from AfD's voter base. And latest polls cited by Der Spiegel actually have her polling at 24% right now. She just got put on the front cover of Der Spiegel, and and 24% is higher than Olaf Scholz's polling right now. He's at like 21%. So she is a force to be reckoned with.
Well, and you anticipated one of the things that I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, because certainly I think many of our viewers are familiar with Sarah Wagenknecht. They might not necessarily know about this new initiative that's being considered of starting a new party. I thought it was interesting in your piece to read that even representatives from the AfD thought that she would be a wonderful Kanzlerkandidatin, right, a candidate to be chancellor, who would basically personify some of the things that even the AfD is interested in. You're absolutely right, of course, in pointing out that on some of the economic issues, the Linke and the AfD couldn't be further apart. And of course, many of the roots of the AfD are in economic policy, and not so much in some of these other issues. But it's fascinating to think about how the political landscape in Germany is changing, and that someone like Sarah Wagenknecht with a party of German unity could pull support from the extreme left and the extreme right. And you talked a little bit about how her polling numbers are, and that she is a force to be reckoned with. But I guess, do you think that there's a real possibility that this new party will come off the ground? And do you think it would really gain traction? And I mean, if so, probably disrupt the political landscape quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, it seems, she's been very openly mulling leaving Die Linke. Die Linke, she's always been a renegade there. She's classed, as you know, with the leadership, mostly over her anti-immigration stance, which of course puts her very firmly in an AfD camp. So the chances are high that she would kind of draw support away from the AfD. I guess the AfD would not be very happy with that. So one of the questions of the article was, we were trying to figure out how or if the Kremlin drew up all these plans, but were they able to communicate any of these plans to either Sarah Wagenknecht or members of AfD? And we didn't see any documents which would demonstrate that. We haven't seen them. But yet we know that Sarah Wagenknecht's ex-husband, Ralph Niemeyer, he said that he was in constant contact with his ex-wife. She herself rather tellingly declined to comment on whether she was in contact or not with her ex-husband, saying those were her private contacts, which is suggestive that perhaps she has been. And we also know that Ralph Niemeyer is very often in Moscow meeting with top-level officials, and he said himself that he was talking with members of the far right and trying to encourage them to come over to Sarah Wagenknecht. And we also know that shortly after the Kremlin drew up these plans, there began to be these calls from within the AfD. Some were chanting her name at protests. We saw one of the leaders from the East Germany, the head of what's his name, Björn Höcke, the head of the AfD in Thüringen, basically invite Sarah Wagenknecht to join the party. And from Alexander Gauland downwards, many AfD members were speaking in support of Sarah Wagenknecht. So it's clear that they recognize this opportunity. And then you also have Jürgen Elsässer, who is the editor of Compact magazine, which is a far right-wing magazine, very often supports AfD. He's the one who put her on the front cover in December, saying that she was the chancellor, the best candidate for the left and the right, and he's very much touting her as Germany's political future. And Elsässer has a long history with Wagenknecht. He used to be on the far left himself till he migrated to the far right. He's always taken a pro-Kremlin line, and he wrote books with Sarah Wagenknecht in the 90s. He's also close with her current husband, Lafontaine. So it's just this very interesting kind of conglomeration that's forming. And I think, it really does seem that the ground is shifting a little bit. If she does set up her own party, yes, it does look like it will be very, very disruptive for the German political scene. It has the potential to essentially wipe the rest of Die Linke off the political map. We saw the German pundits essentially predicting that if she does leave the party, Die Linke won't be able to get more than 5%, so they won't have any seats in parliament anymore. And she will perhaps draw away some of the AfD support, but then, I guess the reason why I wanted to speak about Elsässer was because he was drawing parallels basically for how it might work and how a real union between the far left and far right could happen if Germany is hit by real crisis. That because it's not quite feasible right now because of the diametrically opposing views on the economy. But as the German economy is hit more and more now by higher energy prices, which is likely and what the AfD likes to call the deindustrialization of Germany as a result of having to pay these higher energy prices. They're talking about how already BASF is moving jobs to China, closing down factories and so on. That if Germany were to enter into a real crisis, then essentially the demands of the street would dictate the political landscape. And as we see on the street, the far left and the far right, they're already together on the street.
And it's fascinating when one thinks about how the traditional Volksparteien or catch-all parties of the CDU and the SPD are gaining traction to have a new party appear on the landscape where its leader is polling at 24% is really interesting to watch. I mean, this is certainly something I think for all of us to be watching in the weeks and months ahead. And it's fascinating to think about how disruptive this could be to just the political spectrum in Germany. I guess, sort of coming back to the Russian influence in all of this, I think in your piece, you wrote about the fact that there were some members of parliament from both the Linke and the AfD who traveled to places like Belarus and elsewhere in the East, and where, it's possible that there could have been conversations along some of these lines. I mean, we just don't know how much influence this Russian plot has actually had Can you talk at all about any of the travel that some of the parliamentarians have made and how that might have sort of been a catalyst for some of this as well?
Yes, of course. I mean, so yes, like I mentioned, so the documents, though they describe the great plans of the Kremlin, they don't describe in it or show in any way how they may have, or whether or not they were communicated to any members of the AfD or to Sarah Wagenknecht. We know for sure that Ralph Niemeyer, Sarah Wagenknecht's ex-husband, he was in Moscow in early September, just as the plans for the union were being drawn up. We know from his own social media that he was meeting then with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, with Dmitry Peskov, Putin's press person. And essentially, he also decided to divulge that Peskov had given him a special encrypted phone for secret communications, which Peskov would also strangely not comment on when we tried to ask him. And so we know that he was in contact with Kremlin officials at that point. And from the AfD side, we know that there were several officials who made trips. There were 3 AfD members who tried to travel to Donbass in late September. Though they didn't make it there, they were a whole day in Rostov in southern Russia. So undoubtedly, they were in contact with Russian officials then. None of these party members would respond to requests for comment. So it's not clear whether or not any of these instructions were conveyed to them then. And then the sort of the biggest mystery figure and the most interesting one for me in the AfD is the foreign policy speaker, Peter Bystrun. And he was found to have made a secret trip to Belarus in November. He went there, he went first of all to Lithuania, which is just across the border from Belarus. And he sort of photographed himself on social media, meeting with all these Lithuanian lawmakers. And then he thought secretly he slipped across the border to Belarus, where he spent 3 whole days. And nobody would have known about this trip if Lithuanian officials hadn't leaked the fact that he'd crossed the border into Belarus to Lithuanian and German media a few months later when it was exposed. So Bystrun then admitted to this trip. He told me that he only met with the Belarus foreign minister, that he was only discussing a peace initiative for Ukraine, that he didn't discuss German politics, but he didn't really have an adequate explanation for why he was there for 3 whole days and what he was doing all that time. So it can't be excluded that he was in talks about this. And indeed, he's one of the most avid proponents of this idea that the far left and far right should join. He really is. He's a populist in the kind of the Steve Bannon Trumpist sense of the world. And he was the one that was saying that basically the vertical divides of politics in the traditional sense, they're already being erased. We now have horizontal politics in which it's the populists, as he puts it, in the positive sense of the word, versus the globalist ruling elite. And he says this alliance is already there. It's already here on the streets. And he's a very interesting figure, because he's written a book called Making Europe Great Again, which of course is an allusion to Trump's MAGA plans. And he in fact knows Steve Bannon very well. He writes about that. He's good friends with Nigel Farage, one of the engineers of Brexit here, also a leading populist politician with perhaps also with links to the Kremlin. And he's friends with Salvini of Lega Nord in Italy. So it's like this international of populists, and he is part of it. It's very, very interesting. And he is also, I was told, and this did not make it into the article, we had to cut because there was too many details, but through his wife, he has very good connections. His wife, who is a former Czech diplomat, she has very good links with the Russian foreign ministry. And because of these links, they were able to free a German journalist called Billy Six, who had been taken prisoner in Venezuela. And there were German press articles on this, and really Peter Buistrin, in the days when it wasn't quite so toxic to be so closely aligned with the Kremlin, managed to pull strings in the Russian Foreign Ministry to get this German journalist freed. So he's really very well established with the Kremlin.
And it sounds like he's certainly somebody worth watching more closely and sort of seeing what he might do in the time ahead. You know, early in our conversation, you did mention the Reichsbürger, and of course, there were a series of raids earlier this year in March that kind of brought down the Reichsbürger movement. To what degree are they involved in this sort of coming together of the far left and far right?
It's difficult to say. I mean, from the documents, we could see that the Kremlin political strategists were in the compiling of protests that they were drawing up for September and October. At least they're the ones that we saw last year. Some of them involved protests by the Reichsbürger movement. So, I mean, that's the only documentary evidence that we have seen about any Kremlin knowledge of or involvement in the Reichsbürger movement. I mean, essentially on these protest schedules, there were the time, the date of the meetings, you know, who was going to be organizing them, and slogans that were going to be used at the protests. And so a couple of them were for the Reichsbürger movement. So it wasn't really clear whether the political strategists were drawing up those slogans for the meetings or whether they just happened to know somehow what was going to be used. So it looks more like they were drawing it up, but you know, we can't tell precisely. But then, of course, the common link in this, the common denominator, is Ralph Niemeyer, Sarah Wagenknecht's renegade and loose cannon ex-husband. You know, he is under investigation now for his alleged involvement in the Reichsbürger movement plot. He denies any involvement. So he says what happened was he was giving a speech at one of these protests, after which he was approached by a member of the Reichsbürger movement who he claims he didn't know, who handed him over a bunch of documents and asked him to deliver them to Putin, because he was known to have these contacts at the top level in the Kremlin. He said he had no idea what was in the documents. He didn't look at them until a few days after the protests. And then, of course, when he saw that these documents were essentially about a plot to overthrow the German government, and he was meant to be asking Putin for support in doing so, he said, of course, when I saw them, I immediately contacted the German authorities and handed them over. And it's just a coincidence that that call took place on the same day as the German authorities were raiding properties across Germany, trying to uncover this plot. He even claims that he thinks it was a setup by the establishment. Somebody was handing him these documents to land him in hot water by having his fingerprints on them. But, you know, it's just kind of wheels within wheels. And yeah, we don't know. But certainly it seems that the German authorities believe that he has some kind of affiliation with the Reichsbürgers, and his own house was raided in connection with that at the end of March.
Interesting. That's really interesting. So I'd like to come back to something else that you mentioned earlier, and that is mentioned in the article, that this sort of attempt by the Kremlin is very reminiscent of attempts during the Cold War to sort of create misinformation and create disruption in Germany, but also elsewhere in Western Europe. Can you talk about some of the parallels between the strategies then and this strategy now?
Yes, I guess in the Cold War days, you know, the KGB used to have this practice that we now have heard quite a lot about, called active measures. You know, when they tried to kind of sow discord and split Western unity against the Soviet Union, one of the instruments they deployed then was the peace movement against nuclear weapons and so on. And it's funny that there is a common link now between those involved in these efforts to marry the far left and far right against support for Ukraine, and 80s era peace movement. And that link is Jürgen Elsässer, the editor of Compact magazine, who put Wagenknecht on the front cover. And he, in fact, told me that in the 80s, he was leading the peace movement against the US Pershing missile bases in West Germany, that he had led a human chain from one of the missile bases in the south to Stuttgart, which was hundreds of thousands of people long. So he's been kind of dabbling in this, ever since. So I think for the Soviets, the peace movement was one way to try and undermine NATO, to undermine Western unity against the Soviet bloc. You could argue that perhaps it was a bit more successful then, but that was only because the Soviet Union eventually wasn't able to sustain its standoff against the West in any case. So that the Cold War standoff kind of crumbled of its own accord, less probably because of pressure from the peace movement, but because of the Soviet Union's own economic failings and the reform drive that was launched there. But the KGB, and we can see this from some documents that have been declassified since then, they had their own kind of unit of active measure officers in which kind of deploying the peace movement to undermine support for, Star Wars or other American-led defense initiatives were really key prongs in trying to disrupt and undermine the Western order.
I have a viewer question that also has a historic dimension to it. One of our viewers is curious whether anybody is looking at parallels to the 1920s in Germany, because although the left and Nazis engaged in street battles against each other at the time, the impact was ultimately to destroy the Weimar Republic. Here we are 100 years later, and it appears that the far left and far right are directly cooperating to co-opt or destroy the Federal Republic. Any thoughts on that historical context?
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's an interesting context indeed. So, I think obviously it's a different type of red-brown alliance now, and it's rather ironic that Sarah Wagenknecht, one of the potential leaders at the demonstration in February 25th, she was basically trying to paint the Ukrainian leadership very much as the Russian government tries to. She was alluding to their kind of Nazi ties and kind of basically alluding to these type of parallels, that now it was Germans who should be somehow, combating the Nazis who are ruling Ukraine. So of course this is very, evocative for Germans. And she was also very, in her speech, she was also very skillfully trying to draw on, fears of Germany being pulled into a great war again. So it's a very emotive issue. And she was talking about how we can't allow for German tanks to once again be firing on Russian women and men. So, I think they try to basically manipulate sort of German feelings of guilt about their war against Russia in the 40s, and obviously turn everything on its head. So it's kind of typical Kremlin, almost Orwellian doublespeak when everything gets turned upside down to how it actually.
In terms of sort of turning things upside down, you talked about the fact that many of us are watching what's happening on the battlefield in Ukraine and watching the primary front. Of course, the second front is the information war, and that's where I see this, plot or approach or attempt fitting in very much. But what was interesting in your piece was then also comments by some people that what's happening in Ukraine is actually a proxy war pitting the United States and the West against Russia itself, and not just the Ukraine-Russian conflict that we're seeing unfold. Can you talk a little bit about how people are interpreting this proxy conflict?
I think that's definitely how Russia is trying to paint it. I mean, they, of course, Putin and the Russian leadership, of course, claim that we were forced into this war because the US was using Ukraine as a platform to weaken and undermine Russia. They were threatening our sovereignty, though they've never actually produced any proof of this. I mean, we all know, of course, that NATO was supplying weapons to Ukraine prior to the conflict. But again, it's a question of chicken or egg. Would NATO have been undergoing and doing all the training it was of Ukrainian troops or making weapon supplies had Russia not annexed Crimea in 2014? That's certainly questionable. But Russia really tries to paint the war now as not one that they have launched against Ukraine, but one that they have launched against sort of US hegemony and the collective West that they claim was trying to use Ukraine to undermine Russia. And they try to sort of paint it, and some Russians agree with this now, and it makes the conflict now particularly acute because the Russians really are trying to kind of create a divide. They like to use the term global South, in which, the global South, which has been neglected by the West, can now join with Russia and kind of create a multipolar world and bring an end to US hegemony. And some of the Russians basically have pointed out that, look, this can be quite an effective strategy, particularly at a time, the West has been very anxious and careful not to get too deeply drawn into the war. Of course, yes, the West is providing weaponry now to Ukraine to help it defend itself, but it's been doing so at a pace that is really quite incremental. And the worry is that this year, Ukraine will not have enough weaponry to really succeed in a strong counteroffensive. They may be able to pull back some territory, but essentially it may only be able to take a small amount, which means that we're in for a long, protracted war. And one of the Russian sources I speak to basically say, look, by now this is not a war for Ukraine. The Russians are trying to make this a war about who gets to set the rules globally. You see Russia drawing in closer now with China, and they're trying to make it about, look, this is now a divide between authoritarian nations and the liberal West. And the longer this goes on, the stronger the authoritarian axis could become. And it's really up to us as the West to decide, are we going to defend our fair and rules-based order or not? And at the moment, we're not doing enough to do that.
Mm-hmm. Related to this, one of our viewers is curious how effective you think this Russian narrative has been with the German population and even with the media in Germany. Is the Kremlin successful in its efforts to sort of change the narrative?
I think they're semi-successful just because of the long-standing ties between Russia and Germany, and Russia has had a long and successful kind of round of influence peddling within Germany. We all know about the links of Gerhard Schröder with Putin, and there are many others who are on mainstream media who like to peddle this line that Russia has been under threat from NATO all this time. But I think for now, I think because of the nature of Russia's invasion and the fact that it was never able to come up with any proof that it was facing some kind of imminent attack or offensive or even provocation from Ukraine, they almost kind of, they almost lost the PR war from the beginning, because of course most of the population can see that Russia has been indiscriminately bombing Ukrainian civilians and Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. So they've made it very hard for themselves, and it's clear that support in Germany is still pretty much squarely in favor of continuing sending weapons to Ukraine. But this year is going to be the year when things start to get difficult because, of course, there was a huge emotional response and shock to the way Russia launched the war last year. And also last year, Germany had, cheap Russian gas in storage facilities right up to the summer. And this year it has to pay more all year to get alternative supplies. So the battlefield is going to be much harder. We have this long war of attrition. It's going to be really tough for the Ukrainians to kind of launch a very successful counteroffensive, given the rate of attrition of weapons and the fact that the stocks are depleting for everyone. And the economic size of the economic aid also needs to be still substantial. So we have to really ask the West now to be patient, and Putin is really counting on Western support beginning to wane, and that people ultimately are going to be thinking about their own pockets. Putin believes that, Western democratic systems are inherently weaker than authoritarian regimes. And then at some point, Western politicians are going to have to bow to the people on the streets who just want to live better and not pay so much for energy or deal with the rising cost of livings. And that's what he's counting on. And of course, he has a very beady eye on the US elections. We all know that primaries are coming up, and we can see support in the US for Ukraine. It's not at a turning point yet, but unfortunately, time is ticking.
So you've sort of answered one of the questions that just came in while you were speaking, which is what are the kinds of countermeasures that can be taken to these developments? And I guess, if there's anything that you'd like to add to that, please do. But my closing question to you would be, since your piece came out, what has the response, and since this news has broken, what's been the response in Germany to try to address this? And are there any measures that are being taken that you've observed in the meantime?
I guess we don't know. Maybe that's a kind of a subject for further investigation. We know, of course, that the day after the article came out, Germany expelled a couple dozen more Russian so-called diplomats from their embassy in Berlin. But I believe that was a long-planned move and may have also been partially inspired by Dmitry Medvedev, the former Russian president's remarks that, that there would be Russian troops in Berlin next, or he said something outrageous just before as well. So, I think the German government is now can see very clearly the degree of Russian attempts to directly interfere in the German political scene. I think that's very clear. So I think they're certainly going to be paying closer attention to this, and perhaps they have realized a bit more the scale of the problem. Of course, it's one thing to kick out Russian diplomats, but it's also another to deal with other agents of influence who may be operating under deeper cover. But the West has also been trying to counter this within the populist movement itself. You can see splits now in the AfD itself. Some of them are moaning about the Atlanticization of some of the membership of AfD. There's an AfD MP called Lucassen, who they claim is a stooge of the Atlanticist US-led order, and how he's visiting Kiev and supporting Zelensky. Some of the more traditional AfD members now fear that the Biden administration or others linked to them are starting to play the populist movement too. They're all crying about Giorgia Meloni in Italy. And, she is meant to be the next great white hope for the populist movement, but she turns out to be an avid Atlanticist and supporter of Ukraine. And they feel that their movement is now being infiltrated by the other side. So that's perhaps a good countermeasure to take. But I think the best countermeasure of all is to continue to supply as much weaponry as possible, because the longer the war goes on, the more difficult it's going to be.
Well, Catherine, I want to thank you so much for sharing some insights and some background on your piece. I shared a link to the piece for everybody who's tuned in. So if you haven't read the article, it's well worth going back and reading. But this has been a fascinating discussion, and thank you for pointing out some things that we should definitely keep our eye out for moving forward. And as you continue to follow this story, we'd love to have you back again at some point in the future to talk about the next developments, because there will undoubtedly be further developments in this story. But I just want to thank you again for really taking the time to be with us today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been really interesting to chat. Thanks a lot. Thanks for the great questions.